And this is hopefully going to be rather short and not very theoretically hard to digest, I think. But I will mention some names that you will cringe at. So be prepared for cringe effect. Okay, so in his contribution Toward Perpetual Peace, Kant argues that some wars among states are perhaps ultimately unavoidable, but that it is nevertheless possible to sketch a set of conditions required to at least approach what he calls the sweet dream of philosophers for an everlasting peace among the nations of the earth. This position was heavily criticized by Hegel, who insisted in Phenomenology of Spirit, in the Elements of the Philosophy of Right, and elsewhere, that occasional wars are not simply a sign of human weakness, of unlawful, unprincipled, or otherwise unethical conduct, but that wars, irrespective of the apparent interests of nations involved, also serve a kind of historical purpose, a purpose that is radically beyond any one person or one nation acting within their own time. In an ironic twist of historical progress, Hegel explicitly warns that it is even possible that actively pursuing to secure peace can, as a consequence of this very pursuit, lead to war. So Kant and Hegel thus seem to present two seemingly unreconcilable perspectives on the question of war, based on two divergent, not different, not completely different, but definitely divergent concepts of world history. On the one hand, we have the view that humanity can, and perhaps even at some point will, make wars irrelevant someday. This is what Kant writes. On the other hand, the ultimate goal of wars, and even the goal of radically evil wars, of genocidal, fratricidal bloodshed, might be something that is simply not within human power to understand and engage with. This alternative is in many ways a false one, because as soon as you look into the details of what Kant and Hegel actually argue, you can find a lot of overlapping claims, and neither can be accused of utter naivety. They diverge, most importantly, on the question of how precisely we understand the process of history, whether or not history can be said to have an end, and what role is played in history by human agency. And I want to begin quite straightforwardly by laying out my thesis. I understand Hegel as saying that human institutions cannot exert full control over the historical process. In other words, human institutions cannot possibly guarantee a perpetual state of peace, because historical truth is ultimately out of the reach of human institutions and actions. I don't want to sound, demonic, but this is what Hegel argues. And this is, I think, the ultimate consequence of what Hegel means by the famous too lateness in philosophy with regard to political instructions. Truth is something that emerges from the actions within the world, and not something that dictates or guides those actions. In other words, any attempt at purposefully building a cosmopolitan federation of states, or any other attempt at securing peace for all eternity, is ultimately doomed to failure. Nevertheless, we would make a grave mistake if we accepted this as an argument in favor of a deliberate political isolationism and unilateralism, as a claim that the only viable international policy is to accept that there is no such thing as the world, to paraphrase Margaret Thatcher, and that there are only individual nations who must put their own interests above all else. To articulate this in somewhat tendentious expression, even though we ultimately live in a Hegelian world, we can only proceed in it by following Kantian steps. All right, I hope this thesis makes sense. Now, the central question for me in this Kantian Hegelian framework is the question of the philosophy of history. Recall the argument, now comes the fringe cringe part. Recall the argument that was put forth more than 30 years ago by the political scientist Francis Fukuyama about the quote-unquote end of history. This was in 1991 when Soviet Union was dissolved and the communist project was abandoned in Eastern Europe. Everything was proceeding very quickly. Berlin Wall fell in November 1989 and the Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu was shot to death together with his spouse Elena in December that same year. To use the phrase popularized by a German pop band, the Scorpions, the wind of change was blowing very fast. For a brief moment of time, at the very least, it seemed that the political economic regime of liberal democracy was without a challenger on the stage of world history. It seemed that a specific mixture of parliamentary democracy, economic liberalism, and cultural Protestantism succeeded in securing its own perpetuity in the global theater, not only politically, but also, and more importantly, ideologically. While Fukuyama still allowed for occasional wars to occur and even considered them to a very limited degree structurally necessary, his main point was that with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was history itself that effectively demonstrated that the idea of liberal democracy cannot be significantly improved in the course of time and much less replaced by some superior model of social political organization. All right, so Fukuyama's victory cry of the American way, articulated as a kind of a theoretical claim, was heavily criticized, of course, ever since it was made on almost every point of the argument and from every possible angle. And I think that there is not much sense in repeating those discussions because in many ways, no new argument has actually been presented in a while. Instead, with Jürgen Habermas and Steven Pinker contributing their own visions of the future of the project of the Enlightenment, the debate has actually shifted away from Fukuyama's framework, which defined a lot of the 1990s, early 1990s. So judging from our contemporary situation, where even another world war or a nuclear exchange seem a distinct possibility, Fukuyama's claim can only appear as profoundly naive. Nevertheless, and perhaps provocatively, I argue that there is something that Fukuyama got right, even though not in the sense that he thought he did. I think we should commend Fukuyama for the fact that he brought the very idea of history back to the table. This is a point that was often overlooked, and it is somehow easy to overlook it, because the idea of end of history came in the time when many felt that the era of grand ideological narratives was over, that Enlightenment's project of human emancipation has finally played out, all of its variations, and failed, and that it was time to accept pragmatism as the only sensible political outlook. Indeed, Fukuyama's idea of the end of history could be easily mistaken for just another version of the claim about the end of grand narratives, especially as it was Fukuyama himself who approved of this reading, or at least explicitly coquetted with this parallel. However, what I think separates Fukuyama from so many other theorists of this vein is that Fukuyama explicitly understood the idea of the end of grand historical narratives as another grand historical narrative. The main appeal of Fukuyama's thesis always lay in the claim that it was not communism, but liberal democracy that was the ultimate goal of human progress. In other words, contrary to authors who proclaimed the end of the grand narratives and meekly suggested the acceptance of the natural, quote-unquote, order of things, Fukuyama did not give up on the Enlightenment's grand idea of human progress. Not in essence. And in truth, as soon as Fukuyama's thesis was published, the discussion of history as a conceptual development with an inner purposiveness and not simply as a protocol of the series of events that occurred was heard everywhere, even outside academia. Whether he wanted to or not, Fukuyama thus reinvigorated the notion of history as discussed by German classics like Kant and Hegel, and revolutionized by Marx and Lenin. The notion of human history as an opaque process of the gradual actualization of a concept. What is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational, quote unquote. This is what Hegel writes in The Elements of the Philosophy of Right. And if actuality turns out to embody the idea of liberal democracy, well, then this already implies that it was historical reason itself that was revealed in this idea. So even though Fukuyama's aims in this move may have been subversive, using the Hegelian Marxist notion of historical progress against revolutionary Marxist thought itself, he nevertheless endorsed the proposition that political actuality is the ultimate test of the validity of a political idea. But in a much more practical sense, one could claim that at least for a brief moment in time, there actually was a region in the world that lived this naive fantasy of the end of history as its immediate, unreflected reality. It was, of course, the very region where the dramatic historical shift took place, Eastern Europe. For the most part, the 1990s was a time of prosperity for Eastern Europe. After a series of regime changes and implementations of capitalist reforms, the region caught global attention politically, economically, and culturally. And for a while, at least for those who would seize them, there were indeed an abundance of opportunities for all kinds of grassroots initiatives. Now, if the illusion of the end of history ever actually existed anywhere as a political reality, it was in the brief period of naivety in Eastern Europe of the early 1990s. There was only one real problem at the time, only one glaring exception that defied an easy explanation, only one piece of the puzzle that did not fit, only one case where history appeared to have taken an unfortunate detour. I'm talking about the wars in Yugoslavia. No one appeared to have a good answer as to how those wars were even possible, much less why they were fought, especially as the violence rapidly escalated into mass torture and genocide. Wars in Yugoslavia seemed profoundly out of place and out of their own historical time. Fukuyama himself vehemently insisted on the idea that liberal democracy is the best cure against wars in general, an idea that Kant himself formulated in his essay on the eternal peace. The war as a concept thus also belongs to human past in a certain sense. And if you follow writers like Steven Pinker, you'll remember the title Decline of War as something that he would write as a title of his paper, Decline of War. But for countries emerging from the remains of socialist Yugoslavia, the transition to capitalism was inextricably connected with war and destructive malice, to use Kant's terminology. One of the cultural products that captured this uncanny conjunction of war and capitalism, I think truly effectively, was a series of postcards made by a group designers called Trio Sarajevo. And these postcards were called Ironic Postcards from a City of War, sent from a besieged city, struggling in fear of murderous snipers and heavy bombardment between 1992 and 1995. This is the reason I have this, because I wanted to show you one of these postcards. It's very simple, right? It's just using the slogan, Enjoy Coca-Cola, which I think either we remember or think we remember that we've seen, and just replaces the words Coca-Cola with Sarajevo. So this substitution, and I'm so sorry about the bad quality of I literally just took it off the internet earlier in the break. Sorry for the bad quality. So the substitution of Coca-Cola with Sarajevo does not only establish a link between mass consumption and war, it also underlies the split within Eastern Europe itself, the split between the part that got to enjoy the fantasy of the end of history and the part that got to enjoy the very outrage of history. Judging by the way in which Yugoslav wars were reported and discussed, especially in the Anglo-Saxon West, as basically unintelligible, pre-modern, this was very important, pre-modern ethnic violence, one would be safe to assume that they were considered as a kind of strangely resilient remain of some long-forgotten past, of something that humanity, just as Fukuyama suggested, has essentially already overcome and left behind. Wars themselves seemed of questionable importance in a time when the Cold War was over, and when the US and the newly formed Russian Federation agreed to continue reducing the number of nuclear warheads. Remember those days? Yeah, well, they're gone. Habermas, for instance, thank you, Artemi, for bringing Jürgen to the table. Habermas, for instance, doesn't forget to note in his reflection on Kant's text on perpetual peace in 1995 that the predictions of a World War III between the United States and Soviet Union were wrong. As if that's an argument. Furthermore, the global elites in London and New York called the very status of nation-states into question, pointing out, and Habermas dutifully quotes this, that several multinational corporations have higher GDP than most countries in the United Nations. All of this made national wars in Yugoslavia seem utterly atavistic, even primitive. From the globalist perspective, it looked like Yugoslavia somehow didn't get the memo, that it was lacking behind. But looking at how ideas of isolationism, unilateralism, and exceptionalism have thrived in contemporary world, I think maybe Yugoslavian wars were not lagging in time, but were rather indicative of a possible future. I will just give one example that I personally find truly fascinating. The fact that it was the United Kingdom, the very country which formed the first truly global empire, the very country that has probably historically benefited the most from globalization. The fact that it was this very country that felt threatened by globalization and felt it needed to defend its weak national pride and independence when voting to leave the European Union in the so-called Brexit. I find this fact a really good example of historical irony, especially in the context of the debates from the early 1990s, where it was precisely the British globalists who were dumbfounded by the idea that the primitives in Yugoslavia would care so much about their nation states. Ultimately, I suggest we view the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s as some kind of historical unconscious, as precisely that which had to be repressed in order for us to enjoy the shared illusion of the end of history. I have another similar example from, this is from 2003, film Goodbye Lenin, German movie. Sorry, I prepared this for German audience. I see that was maybe missed. Anyway, it uses a very nice, very simple message. In the same movie, we see a building with a red DDR flag, which is then replaced with a red Coca-Cola flag. It's kind of the same joke, just 10 years later. So East Germany got to enjoy a little bit of the fantasy. I will use the remaining of the time to just briefly compare Kant's and Hegel's concept of historical progress. I have criticized Jürgen Habermas' text from 1995, the one on Kant's idea of perpetual peace with a 200 years difference. But Habermas, I think, is actually a decent reader of Kant and points out very clearly what the problem of Kant's text on perpetual peace is. According to Habermas, Kant is inconsequential in proposing a federation of independent states rather than a constitution of one cosmopolitan world state. Kant is probably simply being realistic in his own time, where France and the United States, writes Habermas, were the only examples of democratic states with the rule of law. But this quote-unquote realism makes Kant sacrifice the correspondence between morals and politics. In other words, it seems unrealistic to expect politics to be moral. Ultimately, Habermas writes, so this is from Habermas, in order to solve this problem, Kant develops a philosophy of history with a cosmopolitan aim that is supposed to make what is at first sight an unlikely correspondence between morals and politics more plausible, since it comes from a secret aim of nature. This is what actually Kant proposes in his idea for universal history. So Habermas argues, in other words, that Kant needed the philosophy of history precisely as a way to deal with a less than perfect state of the art in political geography. Instead of directly prescribing a normative concept of how the world politics should be constituted, Kant, as Habermas understands him, accepts the historicity of the political field as an unavoidable circumstance, but then suggests that it is history itself that will result in cosmopolitanism, as something that is like a germ within human nature itself. What I would like to add to this understanding is only that Kant argues that history can be helped along its way towards cosmopolitanism. Kant writes as his ninth and final thesis on the idea for a universal history with a cosmopolitan aim, so Kant writes this directly, a philosophical attempt to work out universal history according to a plan of nature that aims at the perfect civil union of the human species must be regarded as possible, and furthermore, even as furthering that very aim of nature itself. Now, this is a really interesting, if not even a daring claim, namely that developing an explicit philosophy of history can help the object of that philosophy, the history itself, to realize itself. It reminds me of how Lenin sought to change the course of social democracy in Imperial Russia by writing its history, by listing the periods of social democracy in Russia, and suggesting that the ultimate answer to the что делать question, what is to be done, is simply to, I'll try my Russian now, I apologize in advance, ликвидировать третий период. Was this kind of Russian? So to end, or to liquidate, like to shoot it dead, the third period. In other words, our collective human, this was specifically tailored to Russian что делать audience. In other words, our collective human conceptualization of what the historical progress is resulting in is part of that very result itself. The gesture of the philosopher declaring a certain period of human life to be what it is, and thus committing it to history, is the ultimate political gesture. I'm shorter than that, I think. The gesture of the liquidator, the executioner. Hegel's concept of the end of history, however, is somewhat different. And we can certainly not help bring it about with our conscious actions. We cannot control it. This is especially clear in the way Hegel discusses the ethical necessity of wars throughout his oeuvre, and the way he rejects the idea of perpetual peace. So Kant is the good guy, quote unquote, defending perpetual peace. Hegel is the bad guy, saying that that might not be a very good idea. So in the philosophy of right, Hegel writes, in peace, civil life continually expands. All its departments wall themselves in, and in the long run, man stagnate. Their idiosyncrasies become continually more fixed and ossified. But for the health, the unity of the body is required. And if its parts harden themselves into exclusiveness, that is death. Perpetual peace is often advocated as an ideal towards which humanity should strive. With that end in view, Kant proposed a league of monarchs, Fürstenbund, to adjust differences between states, and the Holy Alliance was meant to be a league of much the same kind. But a state is an individual, and individuality essentially implies negation. Hence, and this is a very important, almost eerie quote, hence, even if a number of states make themselves into a family, this group, as an individual, must engender an opposite and create an enemy. That's pretty grim, if you ask me, but that's Hegel. So for Hegel, perpetual peace is wrong. Perpetual peace, if taken as the explicit goal of human endeavor, can result in effects that are the complete opposite of those intended. Every alliance among states will demand its opposite and thereby create an enemy. Considering the complex network of alliances forged in the 19th century by Germany under Bismarck, with the chief aim to preserve peace in Europe, and then the First War, where a local conflict somewhere on the periphery, in Sarajevo of all places, instantly engulfed the whole of Europe and a large part of the world in a destructive war. it would appear that Hegel got it right. But Hegel goes even further. It seems that he regards war even as something to be welcomed, at least in part. He does not perceive it as an absolute evil and as a purely external accident, quote unquote, because peace, according to Hegel, results in the ossification of the political organism. So Hegel obviously is writing before Verrichtungslager and those kind of things, but still. So I want to underline again that Hegel is not defending war from a cynical standpoint. Hegel is not arguing that war is good for business. Okay, he actually needs war against the business, because business will take care of itself. Business perhaps even prefers peace. This is where he agrees with Kant. So he's not taking the cynical standpoint that war is good business, or that it has some other practical usefulness in political or familial life. Quite to the contrary, Hegel consistently underlined the unnaturalness of war. The very fact that war manages to evade the normal, usual flow of human affairs. The social and political implication of war is only comparable to the one of death. In the context of discussing Sophocles' Antigone, I'm nearly done, Sophocles' Antigone and the ancient Greek form of ethical life, Hegel argues that the death of an individual has its purpose in the familial relationship, because it is only through the process of the ritual of the burial that the institution of family can affirm itself as an institution of spirit, and not merely as a natural community. Similarly, the very existence of wars is explained by the fact that they produce death. This is how, as Hegel writes, the government makes sure that the citizens learn about their absolute master, which is death. Hegel's understanding of war is therefore most radically opposed to how war is treated both in the economic context of war industry and in the context of critique of war as humanity's failure. However, and this is how I finally come back to the thesis announced in the beginning, even though our present historical moment seems radically remote from the ideals of the Enlightenment, I claim that Hegel does not suggest a cynical or even opportunistic political stance. I claim that the ultimate consequence of Hegel's understanding of the political history of mankind is that the end result of our actions, individual or collective, is completely out of our control. Judging by Hegel's thesis on history, there is no specific political organization, national or international, that would merit a normative status for all eternity. However, this also means that any cynical or pragmatical or realistic frameworks for political organization are equally subject to the test of history. And it is in this context, and in this context only, that I believe that ultimately Kant's advice somehow does make sense, even if for the opposite reason that Kant gave. So it is actually if and only if history is radically open that the best course of action for individuals or states is to act in good faith in the cosmopolitan future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We can open the floor to questions.
Hi. Thank you for the very relevant discussion. I have a nerd's objection that technically speaking, Kant makes an argument that is very similar to Hegel's. The eternal peace text. First of all, it's not really univocally in favor of the peace. He starts with a joke that peace is death, etc. And then he says also that wars have happened throughout the history of humanity, and it is good that they happen, because by happening, they kind of teach humans how to live in peace, basically. They help the humans to integrate. So it's a little bit, the logic is a little different from Hegel's, but he's also dialectical in this sense. And Hegel, of course, one of the main concepts of his philosophy is Befriedigung, the reconciliation. and it is a philosophical reconciliation with the other, but it also, of course, has a very direct political connotation. So even though, yes, history is open, and I know your argument about this, it doesn't all end in one state, there is history, but nevertheless, the teleology of dialectics, of the speculative reason, is to reconciliation. So I think the two authors are saying more or less the same thing. Hegel is a good Kantian, Kant is a good Hegelian.
So we can have the second one?
Yes, I basically agree with Artemi, actually, so we don't have to wait for other questions. I basically agree with you. Nevertheless, I do think that there's a little divergence which allows me to... Yeah.
Vive la petite différence.
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting. I'm wondering what, say, Steven Pinker is thinking about right now.
I think he's defending the decline of
the
war.
world.
I think he's still defending the decline of war.
I don't know. Say what Fukuyama is saying, we know because he does say something. I don't know about Pinker. But as for me, I think that indeed, like philosophy of war is becoming much more relevant right now than philosophy of peace. And things connected to peace, like business, for instance. So about Kant and Hegel. So Hegel is famous, the most famous biographical scene about Hegel, I think, is his insight in Jena in 1806 when he saw Napoleon and kind of invented his idea of the world spirit, which was kind of which was a conception of the idea of heroism and romantic idea of the global leader bringing humanity to progress by military victory. While we know nothing about similar, at least I think that Kantians know nothing similar about Kant, even though Kant has his formative experience during the Russian occupation of Königsberg during the 7 Years' War. And I'm still amazed. I wrote about this particular story and presented as formative for Kant's philosophy of kind of sort of historical optimism. I will say a little bit about that. I wrote about that about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and the Kantian world has not responded. It's like mute and deaf about this particular story. Even though I think it was as formative, this Russian occupation of Königsberg and his life in the occupied and annexed Königsberg was as formative for Kant as this experience in Jena was formative for Hegel. They were both in their 30s, like Fukuyama in the late 80s. And that was really kind of hugely significant for Kant. So what happened, just in a few words, what happened there in Königsberg then was that the Russian troops retreated with no warning, no reason. That was a victory of Frederick the Great, a great victory of Prussia, and Kant was definitely a patriot. But this victory had no sense, no meaning whatsoever. It was just an accident of history. That was dramatic, aggressive war was just stopped by the death of a very distant empress. They had nothing to do in Königsberg to do. So, and that sort of, I think actually that Kant was puzzled by these events, by their senselessness throughout the decades of his life, which eventually led him to this idea of perpetual peace that had to avoid, like to escape this kind of abuse of power by a tyrant.
So thank you for this response. Do you want to collect more questions?
Just one, Andreas is one, and then we'll finish our 40 minutes.
Okay.
Anyway.
I do have a response for that.
Andreas?
Yes, probably this is a minor comment because it addresses the point you made about the wars in Yugoslavia and the inability of the liberal thinkers at the time to make sense of it and to relegate it to a past. And you said that probably it was a prefiguration of the future. in a kind of sense. So my question is that, my comment rather, is that this idea of the end of history, only liberals believed it. And not many of them, all of them. The most hardcore, this kind of liberal euphoria, because the 90s were a very, very conflicting decade. 1994, the Zapatista uprising. 1999, the battle in Seattle, the alter globalization movement. Not to mention the two wars in Mesopotamia from 1991 to 2002. So it's not only that the wars in Yugoslavia were a prefiguration, because everything that was happening at that time was a prefiguration. The liberals were just in denial, living their own fantasy. But I'm not sure how convincing was that at that time to many other perspectives, interpretations of what was happening. So I mentioned this because when you said that Yugoslavia might have been the future, I think you can add also all these wars that were happening in the Middle East, the uprisings in Mexico. It was also the beginning of the big movement in Latin America towards the end of the 90s. So many things were changing that made this thesis. Even Fukuyama himself, he has rejected it. A few years ago, yes, he made his self-criticism, and he said that after all, it was not the end of history. So.
Okay, that surprised me, because I've listened to, I was at a couple of events, and he still insisted on the topic. So I'm surprised. All right, should I answer? All right. So I'll start with Alexander's question, which I take to be a question, or your response basically, take to be, it reminds me of the question of the world historical individual in Hegel, which is a very important question of how history turns around, because it needs something. For Hegel, it needs like a monarchic figure like Caesar, Alexander, Napoleon. This is what Hegel really wants to have, like a pin that, makes the historical pivot possible. But I think how some people understand is that Hegel is actually making some sort of praise of Caesar, in praise of Napoleon. I don't think that's actually his point. I think Hegel's point is that it was these people, just like everyone else, did not know what they were doing. They were just following their own particular ambitions. It's really this idea of providence from the older metaphysical tradition. These people personally just followed their own objectives. However, it just so happened that the historical purposes aligned with those purposes. So as far as Hegel is concerned, Pompey could have won the civil war. And we would have the idea not of Kaisertum, but of Pompeitum. And that would have been good enough. So that's my response to the idea of world historical individual. It's really just the fact that it happened that it aligned with the historical aim. Okay, Andreas, the question of the fantasy, yes, of course, you are absolutely right. And if I made it feel like we all believed it in a naive sense, then of course we didn't. I merely suggested that perhaps on some naive level, this fantasy was lived perhaps only in Eastern Europe. This is why I focused on Eastern Europe, because, well, for Eastern Europe, well, something did change, and I think it would be wrong to say that it didn't. It did change. Certain things were possible which weren't possible before. And it took, for the most part in Eastern Europe, it took at least a decade before images like this could show in Eastern German or in German television. This was in 2003. So it took some time before the realization caught up with the population. Of course, the critics knew that it's all bullshit and it's, you just change one flag with another. That's all that happened. Of course, the critics were already there. But to have this, to use Hegelian terminology, to have this knowledge as recognized in the population, this took some time. The labor of the concept and all that. It took some time. And it was in this set, in my longer version, I have other examples. There's one example of Český sen, a film from 2004. It's made, I don't know if you guys don't know it, but it's a beautiful film. It just shows two fresh filmmakers making a new hypermarket, calling it Český sen, which means Czech dream. And it's a fake hypermarket. It turns out in the end to be just a huge poster with scaffolding, and it says Czech dream. And they have like huge advertisement for that, don't come to the opening because it's a lie, the prices are so low, this cannot be true. But thousands of people showed up, and so this was kind of like a moment of, look, this is a fantasy. Let's not, it took some time before this was accepted culturally in Eastern Europe, that it's really just an idiot's fantasy and not a realistic appraisal of the world. So I completely agree with you that this was just, this was idiotic, there was nothing to that thesis, and that it wasn't even shared across Europe.
I think you underestimate, Andres. There are many of such liberals. I remember this time. American academia. People told me why do I need to learn any other languages? They will soon only speak English. Boris Groys, famous Russian and German philosopher, wrote books like all the cities will soon become alike. You don't need to move anywhere. It's boring to live in such a world. There was lots. It was not everyone, like intelligent people like you and I, never bored. Very few.
I want to go back to this Hegel's metaphor of war as something that is necessary for the living organism to restore its kind of balance, to fight against the stagnation, and this, of course, refers to his the very idea of the dialectics, war as a second step, as a negativity, as a negation, that is necessary for something positive to, for the history to proceed, for something positive to realize itself, and what in the Soviet Union was called thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So it's necessary for a synthesis, and then Hegel's eternal peace, or like the homogeneous state, as Kojève was dreaming about it, would then be the synthesis, right? But it's just like my personal experience. Whenever I'm talking with people from the Balkans, I learn that we have nothing to learn from the war, that there is no synthesis, that there is only the experience of negativity, which is pure destruction, deprived of any positive, that doesn't bring any positive result, just devastation. What is your idea about this? Yeah.
Thank you. I think this is, unfortunately, a very timely and a very important question. Oksana, you and I both came from a conference recently in Ljubljana, which was dedicated to the question of, to a fringe question of how the Yugoslav wars were represented in art, but we also touched on the question, of the lessons from the war. And yes, what you say is definitely true. The profound lesson that Bosnians can teach us about war is that there is absolutely nothing to learn from that shit. That's the really grim part about what happened. And you'll remember that Damir Arsenjević, who's a professor from Tuzla, was explaining that, what they live is not the horrors of war anymore. They live the horrors of peace. And this is another perhaps very interesting thing that happened to Bosnia. The war didn't finish. The war was just frozen by the Dayton agreements in 1995. And it was basically what happened in Lebanon, I think a few decades earlier. So the warring sides are still basically at war, even though, no one is shooting anyone. I don't have like a redeeming, there is no silver lining, and I think this might be the grim reality of why in the end I do think that perpetual peace is maybe not a completely idiotic thing, even though obviously we cannot achieve it directly.
Okay.